And before we get started, go to the little view icon up in the right-hand corner and select speaker view. And if you have questions during the presentation, feel free to type them into the chat.
Okay.
Michale, it's all yours.
Do I have the power to share?
Yes.
Okay. And how's that look? Can you see that?
Yes.
If folks have questions during the talk, because I'm on a tiny screen, I'm not sure that I will see them. So if anyone else wants to read them and yell them out to me, I don't mind that at all. But I got a small screen on a laptop, so I don't know that I'll be able to see all of those components. But anyway, thank you. First of all, thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it. I'm excited to share some information from our long-term research with you, and I'm always excited to meet people at a new Audubon chapter that I haven't talked with before. I have presented this work for a couple of different chapters, but I am thankful that North Shore Audubon is interested. And I will talk, of course, about boreal birds and the research that we've been doing here in the park for a bit of time now. I want to, before I get into that, just acknowledge the other two logos on this first slide here. I, as mentioned, am from the Adirondack Watershed Institute, which is a program of Paul Smith's College. But this is actually work that goes back quite a ways and that I began at my former employer, which was the Wildlife Conservation Society, which is the Bronx Zoo. So probably you all have heard of that organization. They had a field program in the Adirondacks for many years, and that's where I was for 15 years before coming to Paul Smith's about 3 years ago. So this work goes back to WCS, and I brought it here with me to AWI. The other logo you see is the Shingle Shanty Preserve and Research Station, which is about a 15,000 acre tract in the absolute middle of nowhere in the Adirondacks. It's vaguely near Long Lake. The director for which is my good friend and colleague, Steve Langdon, and he's a person that I've done quite a bit of this research with. So I want to acknowledge both of those organizations and folks as contributing to all of this research. So, oops, there we go. So which birds are we talking about? The birds that I collectively refer to as boreal birds that are the subject of this long-term monitoring. We call them boreal in part because if you looked at their...
From being in Alaska, working with lake trout and migrating salmon, I've
Someone else talking?
Birds. I've done black bear work. That's Addie and I. Addie is short for Adirondack. That's a picture of us in the.
I don't know what that is. Is anyone else hearing that?
Yep.
Yeah, but I've muted
It
her
sounded
now.
like a repeat of some sort.
I don't know what that was.
Okay. All right, that was just somebody on a conversation that had unmuted, but they're back on mute.
Anyway, so these birds, if you looked at their range maps in your Sibley guide or any place like that, they would look a lot like that green part of the map up in the upper left hand corner, and that is a map of what we call, at least within North America, on that map, the boreal geographic zone. And the Adirondack Park sits kind of very much on the edge between the boreal zone and the temperate zone. Most of the Adirondacks is northern hardwood, sort of classic temperate forest, but it's a place in which we have interspersed little bits of these habitats that if you're in them, sort of, you get the feeling that somebody might have picked you up and distributed you, many hundreds of miles to the north. They remind us that, we are still a really northern landscape. And so the birds that we've been studying are the birds that inhabit these same kind of places, and their ranges look very much like that. They are widespread in the Canadian boreal to our north, and to the extent that they occur where we are, we're really quite close to the southern range extent, at least of where they breed in large numbers. And for that reason, they are, I believe, a good indicator of what happens with populations on the range margin, and in particular, what happens with populations that we think are sensitive to climate change because they are very northern types of birds. So the ones that you see spelled out across the bottom of the slide are the ones that I find often enough that I can tell you anything about them, and they are official targets of our long-term monitoring, including the blackback woodpecker, the boreal chickadee, the Canada jay, which I will still probably call the gray jay a few times because I haven't got used to the name change just yet, the Lincoln sparrow, the olive-sided and the yellow-bellied flycatcher, the palm warbler, and the rusty blackbird. I do need to mention that there are another handful of species that are, technically on the target list for this project, and we just don't find them often enough that I can really say much about them. One of them is the spruce grouse, which of course is sort of the flagship boreal species, and we don't find them because we are not using methods that are appropriate to detecting that bird. But fortunately, there is a very large long-term project on spruce grouse in the Adirondacks led by Angie Ross at DEC. So a fair amount is known about spruce grouse, but not from my work. The other four down in the right-hand corner are the other woodpecker that has 3 toes, the 3-toed woodpecker. The blackback has 3 toes also. And the 3 warblers that are often referred to as the budworm warblers, the Cape May, the bay-breasted, and the Tennessee warbler. So they're all officially targets for this program. I just don't find them often enough to really be able to say what's happening with those species, unfortunately. The habitats that we are working in, again, I collectively refer to them as boreal habitats. But if you were to talk to somebody from the Nature Conservancy or the Heritage Program, they would give you these much more official sounding names. All of the places that we're working in fall into one of these ecosystem types as mapped by the Nature Conservancy. I tend to think more about them, and I think maybe the birds don't divide them that much of a fine scale. I tend to think about them in the categories on the left, these sort of groupings of peatland habitats. So kind of your classic bog, as you might imagine, a big open sphagnum dominated bog. The northern swamp habitats, which are similar but have a little bit of a richer underlying substrate than do the highly acidic and nutrient poor bog habitats. So the northern swamps are more what you might think of as a fen, tend to have a little bit more of a tree and shrub cover characteristic to them. And then kind of at the other end of the gradient is boreal upland forest. And that's often on the edges of the places that we're working. And most of our sites really are kind of a mixture of all 3 of these things. There are a few that are strictly the big open peatland and just a small handful that are primarily forest, but most of them are kind of an intermixing of all of these types of things. And these are, again, very northern types of habitats. They are adapted to northern disturbance processes. They are accustomed to being cold, wet places. And so we sort of expect that they will be sensitive to climate change. The threats that I think about that are potentially impacting these habitats are a few different things. As mentioned in the introduction, I have spent quite a bit of time studying the impacts of residential development on wildlife, particularly birds in the Adirondacks. And in this case, development that's not sort of in town, but we call it exurban development. It's kind of backcountry, sprawling, large lot size development. And so that is a threat that I'm cognizant of. I don't think it's hugely relevant to these species, but we can see a signal from it, and I'll talk a lot more about that. Similarly, logging, not a big threat in the Adirondacks. However, there are some sites, some of our big open peatland sites that have had logging, in and around them recently. And there's certainly a lot of these habitats that are owned by forest management companies. But in comparison to, the Canadian boreal, for example, which has lost a lot of forest due to things like tar sands development, logging is not really that critical of a threat here in the Adirondacks. I think really the most important threat and the one you'll hear the most about from me is the threat of climate change. These are graphics I extracted years and years ago, and they're still absolutely very relevant. This is a northern kind of habitat, and it is those high latitude types of environments that we're seeing the greatest change in with regard to climate change. The project goes back to I want to say 2003 or 4, when we first started getting out into some of these habitats. It really got a significant boost from a grant from the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation in 2007. And that was what's called a state wildlife grant. And that gave us the opportunity to do what we as scientists don't often get the opportunity to do, which was really to just go out and kind of get the baseline. These were habitats, some of the large, kind of spectacular and charismatic wetland complexes in the Adirondacks, fortunately have high protection on them, and they had been invested in by the state and by the Nature Conservancy and land trusts, largely on the basis of plant ecology surveys that had been done in these places, with less known about the faunal communities within them. And so we got a state wildlife grant that supported us in 2007, 8, and 9 with robust funding that enabled us to sort of get this project off the ground and look at just kind of baseline information of what is the status and distribution of these species, and what habitats are they in, which habitats are most important. And it just so happens that we've managed to keep, despite the fact that that original grant was only 3 years long, since 2009, so quite a while later, we've managed to keep that monitoring going, and we now have about a 15-year data set. Some years with better funding than others, but it's not that expensive, and we've managed to get continued support from DEC to keep that work going. And so I'm benefiting now from what within the realm of ecology is a pretty long data set of how these birds are doing in the park. And those dots that you see on the map are the roughly 60 locations that we have tried to get to each year as a part of the monitoring. The methods are extremely high tech. We go out and stand for 10 minutes and listen. And that is the kind of field work that I love to do. They are called point counts, the method that we do. Each of the sites that we work in has a transect of 5 points within it. And so our replication is spatial rather than temporal. We only go to the site once in the season, but we spend roughly an hour visiting 5 points within a bigger wetland looking for all of these birds. And so we stand, do a 10-minute count, and record all of the species that we see or hear. The overwhelming majority of detections are by ear, so I have to have folks that know bird song pretty well to do the work, but it's again pretty low tech, low impact. I did go so far as to make a smartphone app this past summer that enabled some folks that wanted to collect data that way, but really it's a pretty straightforward, are the species there or not sort of a protocol. So just to give you an idea of the data that we have compiled over this long-term period, and which birds are kind of most common and which aren't, these are numbers I haven't updated probably in a year, but this is kind of indicative of the pattern that we've seen for a long time, whereby among our 8 or so species that we find often enough to do trend analysis with, the yellow-bellied flycatcher, the palm warbler, and the Lincoln sparrow are always the ones that we, they're the top. And then there's kind of a second tier of gray jay, blackback woodpecker, and olive-sided that are we find them, not too terribly many of them, but we do find them. And then at this point, boreal chickadee and rusty blackbird are both in the low elevation habitats that I'm working in, kind of right on the edge. We are finding them, but more and more seldomly, unfortunately. And then the ones below that, as I mentioned, the bay-breasted Tennessee and the Cape May and the three-toed, those are species that I think, to the extent that they are still breeding here, it's probably in a very small number of locations. Spruce grass we know is a separate case, but those other 3 budworm warblers, I think primarily are just moving through and maybe only breeding in a few places because we just don't find them very often at all. I've been fortunate to have folks that have worked on this project for a long time who know all of the birds and not just the boreal target species. And so they give me information about all the birds, which is terrific. And you can see there some of the ones that we find in addition to the boreal targets most often in these habitats, things like white-throated and common yellowthroat, Nashville, hermit thrush, magnolia warbler. So we have spent a bit of time, now that we have a bigger data set, looking beyond just that baseline information and trying to understand the trajectory of the population of these birds and what is responsible for the trends that we see. And these are three sort of hypotheses or ideas that we have explored with initial analyses of our data set. And so I'm going to talk through sort of what we were trying to figure out and what our hypotheses were with regard to these three potential influences on the boreal birds. One of which is metapopulation dynamics. And that's not so much a threat per se, it's just an investigation of the way that these populations work. And it is a population structure that applies to any sort of species that inhabits a patchy kind of habitat. So rather than one who is sort of throughout the landscape, like for us ovenbird, which is everywhere in the Adirondacks where there's forest, this is the kind of population dynamics that might apply to a species whose habitat exists in discrete patches. So vernal pool amphibians is another good example of this. And here is your 1-minute biology lesson on metapopulation dynamics. And this all relates to sort of notions of island biogeography that you may have heard of before. What we see in a metapopulation is that the landscape consists of large patches that we know have high quality. They are big, they are well connected, and they tend to have lots of individuals, and those are called source areas on the landscape. They have at the same time interact with smaller and more isolated patches of habitat that are called sink habitats or sink populations. We know that birds maintain populations through births, and in the source habitats, we produce a lot of individuals, and through deaths, and we tend to lose more individuals in the sink habitats. But the population functions through movement of individuals by immigration and emigration throughout these different kinds of patches. So that it's really sort of a network, and the source populations are going to have a lot of birds in them, but not everybody can fit in the source habitats, and the sink habitats are important as well. And so this leads to predictions about what we'll see on the landscape, which are pretty simplistic. As you might imagine, we expect that the big wetlands are going to have more birds in them, especially the big wetlands that have more boreal habitat nearby. And those smaller, more isolated, patchy, tiny wetlands probably are not going to be able to foster as many birds as the bigger ones. So those are sort of predictions from your generic metapopulation biology ideas. The second one is climate change. And this, of course, is relevant to these birds again, because this is a northern type of habitat and northern types of species. These are just a few examples from the scientific literature of the kinds of changes that are being documented day after day, that are, the result of climate change and its impacts on wildlife populations and ecosystems. Probably the most relevant to us, and the one that we've tried to look into in this work, is that notion of, the range shifting and species moving northward, and that's being seen in all kinds of different taxa all over the globe, really. So we might predict from climate change research that birds would move either northward in latitude or in elevation over time. And we can look at that again, because we have a longer term data set now. We can ask, over time, are we more likely to see them in our high latitude sites? And or do we see a difference between low elevation and higher elevation? This is not mountaintop work, but within the range of our sites, are they moving to the more high elevation ones? I should note that elevational movement to the truly high boreal is an option for some of these birds, but not all of them. And boreal chickadee is a good example of a bird that I'm having a harder and harder time finding in the low boreal, but it can use mountaintops just fine, and it may be using those habitats. We chose not to focus on the high elevation boreal as part of this research because the Mountain Birdwatch program already existed and is a high elevation land bird monitoring program. So we're focused just on the lowland. So there are a few species for which what I'm seeing in the low might be mitigated by them moving up to the mountaintops, but there's no way for me to be absolutely sure about that. And the last thing that we have looked at as a potential driver for these birds is urbanization or ex-urbanization, if you want to talk about it in the sense of more what I have looked at here in the Adirondacks. We know from many, many years of research that even though we don't have sort of true urban habitats in the Adirondacks, we do have a landscape in which people live, and we have houses and we have roads, and those anthropogenic features on the landscape do impact our wildlife communities. And we have found over time through a lot of research here that the impacts of those developments have a bigger footprint than their physical footprint. You might have a small house and a small yard, but we can see sort of changes to bird communities, up to 200 meters away from an individual home, which translates to 30 acres. And roads similarly have sort of an impact zone associated with them. So we know that there are impacts. We also know that urbanization and climate change both tend to lead to sort of simplification of biological communities. And those are just some of the findings that have come about from our research and the research of others. And we can make predictions from that as well, that our birds would be more likely to colonize or move into our sites that have low human impact, and they would be more likely to abandon the sites that have high human impact. So you'll hear me use a couple of terms as I talk about this work, and these are sort of what we call the vital rates or population parameters for these birds. What I actually am looking at is the probability that we find them in any given habitat that we visit, and the probability that they stick around there. So colonization means I was there last year, the bird wasn't there, the following year it is there. It has colonized that habitat, we call it. The reverse of that is local extinction. I was there this year, the bird was there, I go back next year, it's gone. So those are the sort of parameters that I'm looking at when I do the trend analysis. And when you hear me say things like extinction, it is not population extinction. It just means, they've abandoned that individual site. So we measured each of those characteristics that I talked about in order to test some of these hypotheses. We measured how big each of the wetlands were, how connected they were, how much additional habitat was nearby. In an early phase of this analysis, in order to look at climate change, we were just testing these sort of proxies for climate change in the realm of elevation and latitude. Were we seeing birds moving up in latitude or up in elevation over the course of our sampling in terms of where we were most likely to find them and where they were persisting? And human footprint. We looked at a map of the human footprint in the Adirondacks, which is a representation of sort of the anthropogenic features on the landscape. And then we take that information for each of our sites and put them into population models and test the degree to which those things influence the long-term trends that we see for these birds. So before I talk about any of those hypotheses and what we found and whether we were right or wrong about any of our predictions, I'll just show you the trends. And unfortunately, this has become kind of the more dominant story here, is just what the trends actually are, because they are largely negative, unfortunately. The palm warbler is an exception. It does have an increasing trend, and the Canada jay seems to be relatively stable, kind of holding its own. But the other species, the other 6 species, all show this pattern of decline over the time. In this case, you're looking at a 10-year data set between 2007 and 2016. I'm about to do the 15-year analysis up and coming. And so some of these are declines that we were already aware of. We knew, for example, that rusty blackbird was exhibiting, one of the largest declines of any neotropical or any migrant bird sort of, in the continent, and has been for a number of decades. Similarly, decline in olive-sided flycatcher had been noted in other projects. But some of these we didn't know so much about, and they trouble me, in particular for things like black-backed woodpecker and boreal chickadee, because those are birds that are here year-round. So we can't even blame whatever's happening to them on, what's happening in the wintering grounds, which we know is a whole other set of potential issues that they might be facing if they are migrants and go to other places. Whatever's happening with those species here, that is the driver is right here in our landscape. So the trends are largely negative, unfortunately. I don't know if there's anybody listening who is mathematically or statistically inclined, but you might be suspicious of these beautifully curvilinear graphics and population changes. And the reason that they look like that is just because of the way that the models work. What you actually do is calculate the probability that you're going to find the bird in year 1 and the vital rates of extinction and colonization. And you sort of, the subsequent years get calculated from those rates. And that's why they look perfectly smooth like that. Actual populations don't look like that. It's just that this is the most statistically reliable information. But I can show you what it looks like if you ask the models to actually give you the numbers for each year. This is probably more of the reality on the ground. They do bounce around a bit. But again, even if you take these rates, which have higher errors associated with them, but even if you take these numbers and run the trend line through them, the trends are the same. You can still see that the palm warbler has got an increasing trend. The Canada jay is pretty much flat, but the other ones are pointed in a downward direction. And if you just apply your sort of basic, high school math and look at where that red line is eventually going to cross the x-axis, you can unfortunately make some kind of depressing predictions about, how long, if the trend continues, we will have some of these species persisting in our landscape. So unfortunately, that's kind of become the more dominant story of the research because we weren't expecting quite this strong of trends for some of these species. So after this initial analysis, we first looked at these issues with about a 5-year data set. And we were able to confirm some of our predictions, namely that, as our metapopulation biology textbook would have told us, the bigger, more connected wetlands were the good ones. That was where we found more birds, and that's where they were more likely to persist, as we had expected. Similarly, the areas that had lower human footprint, fewer houses, fewer roads, fewer sort of anthropogenic influence on the landscape, were places where we were more likely to find these birds, and they were more likely to stick around. Whereas in the isolated places with higher degree of impact nearby, of roads and houses nearby, they were more likely to abandon those sites. So we confirmed those predictions. With regard to climate change, and in this case, we were asking about latitude and elevation, so kind of proxies for climate change. At that point, the signal was a little bit mixed. Some species did seem to be sort of moving northward over time and or up in elevation, but some didn't. And so that led us to move to the next phase of the work with a longer data set to dig more into the actual climate data. And that's what I'll talk about for the rest of the talk, is sort of specifically what is the role of climate in influencing the trends that we're seeing now. And can we identify places that maybe are holding on to their northern bird community better than other places are? And that's where the research has focused a little bit more recently. So to do this, we need actual climate data instead of just information about latitude and elevation. Unfortunately, the Adirondacks, like many rural places, especially in mountainous regions, we suffer from a lack of weather stations. We have a handful of them, but we don't have a lot of them. And so if we want to know sort of on a fine scale degree what's happening in this peatland versus another one that's 20 miles away, seldom are we actually going to have on the ground information about temperature, precipitation at those sites. I wish that I did have data loggers for those things in all of my sites, but I don't. So we have to use a modeled climate product. And what we used is produced by a group called the PRISM Group out of Oregon. And what they do is to take all of the available information from the weather stations that we do have, and then combine it with information about slope and elevation to sort of interpolate what's going on the landscape. And that way we can actually look at differences in temperature and precipitation patterns throughout all of the sites that we're studying. So we got into the PRISM information and we extracted data for the mean, the variation, and extremes in both temperature and precipitation, and both during the breeding season and the wintering season. Some of our birds are here year-round. Most of them leave, but there are a handful that are present. So we were interested in both the breeding season and the winter. And we extracted information on average conditions, but also on variation and extremes. And the reason for that is because when I started doing this work and sort of looking into the literature, I really quickly learned that there was no universal climate variable that you're supposed to look at if you want to know the impacts of climate change. Well, it could be the average conditions. It could be how crazy it is. It could be about variation. It could be about extreme events. And it really depends on what you're looking for and how they might be vulnerable. And so we pulled out all of those data and tried to test all of those things because we weren't sure what would be the most important factors. As it turns out in this particular study, and this is not true in other studies necessarily, it's different for all species, but in this study, what we found was that average conditions were more important in determining the patterns we saw in these birds than was the variability and or the extremes. So the rest of what you'll hear me talk about refers to sort of on average conditions in these sites. Oops. So this slide is an attempt to collapse information from lots of different models, lots of different climate variables, and 8 different bird species into one graphic that captures what we found. And that's a complicated thing to try to do, but this was the best I could do to try to, without showing you lists and lists and lists of models. This is sort of the story that we found with regard to these climate variables. With respect to precipitation, we found that it was a more important driver during the winter than it was during the breeding season, and it was generally a negative influence. So what I mean by that is sites that were wetter on average, either from rain during the breeding season or from snow or rain during the winter, were less likely to be occupied and remain occupied by these birds. Temperature, on the other hand, was more important during the breeding season than it was during the winter. And it was primarily a positive influence. So sites that were warmer on average during both the breeding season and during the winter season were more likely to be occupied and to remain occupied over time. So that gives you a sense of what this starts to look like when you actually look at climate data as opposed to latitude and elevation and how these influence our bird species. And they turned out to be highly, highly influential, as much or more as any of those other factors like wetland size and connectivity and all those things that I talked about previously. So the next thing that we wanted to do was to take advantage of the fact that we now know sort of quite a bit about where these populations are going and sort of, you know, what might be driving those changes. But we also have information for other birds that occur in these habitats and not just our boreal target species. So if we know, for example, that the boreal species are changing and maybe declining, can we sort of project where these places are headed? And can we look at the rates of change in different places and identify those that might be, you know, potentially hanging on to their northern birds and that might be important refugia for them over time that we should really pay attention to because they are, you know, keeping that northern bird characteristic better than other sites. So for this portion of the research, we looked at all of the bird data that we have. We have, over the course of this work, detected, you know, 3/4 probably of the species that are known to breed in the Adirondacks at one time or another. We've heard them in these wetlands, so we know these are important places. We had enough information for 57 of them that I could calculate sort of population trajectories for those species. And so I did that for other birds, non-boreal target birds. And I just looked at the degree to which, you know, could we see any patterns among different guilds of birds? Were these changes being driven by, you know, shrub nesting birds or the boreal birds or flycatchers or something like that? And we wanted to sort of look at this both from the perspective of the characteristics of species that were persisting and or being lost, but also of the sites themselves. Could we sort of take that question and turn it sideways and ask not just within the individual birds what's changing, but what are the sites that are sort of changing fast or not changing fast? So when I looked at the community level information across the, what did I say, 57 species that we could calculate trends for, We found 16 that were exhibiting a significant pattern of decline. And you've already heard me talk about half of those. Those are the boreal birds. With palm warbler and gray jay being the exception, there were 6 other boreal species that we saw that pattern of decline. There's a couple of other species that I would characterize as boreal that we saw declines in that weren't on our original target list, and maybe they should have been, like Canada warbler, for example. Not an official target bird for this work, but also a bird with a similar kind of distribution that is declining. So half of the 16 birds that were showing a downward trajectory are all those northern birds that are unfortunately the ones that we are looking for. Among the others that were declining, they were a bit of a mix, including some, troubling to me, birds that I would consider to be common birds. Common grackle, red-winged blackbird, junco, song sparrow were examples of other species that I saw decline in. The ones that were declining in occupancy to the extent that we could explain it in terms of a particular guild, it really was primarily that boreal guild. It was that group. And so we sort of just reconfirmed what we had seen when we were looking only at that species, that set of species. I did see, though, some declines also among some forest interior and scrubland birds, some neotropical birds, some blackbirds and flycatchers, and some shrub nesters. It's important for me to say that the guilds are not mutually exclusive. So of course we can have a boreal bird that's also a shrub nester, or a boreal bird that's also a flycatcher. So it's hard to parse these things out entirely, but for the most part, what was driving these community level changes was really, unfortunately, my northern birds that are the ones that I'm looking for in these places. So then the last thing we tried to do was to say, can we ask this question not from the perspective of the individual species themselves, but from the sites? Can we take the information on the richness of these communities and look at how that is changing over time in each of these individual sites, and identify the characteristics of sites that might be changing fast or changing more slowly? And if we can find the ones that are hanging on to these birds, maybe those are the ones that we should pay attention to. So we had some thoughts about what might be driving changes within individual sites. And one of those was competition. We know that both urban development and also climate change is making things move around on the landscape, and it can bring in new species that weren't previously in these habitats, or they weren't there in high numbers, some of whom are really good sort of generalist competitor type birds. I think of this in terms of, a gray jay who's got a bunch of blue jays coming in, or a rusty blackbird that all of a sudden faces a whole bunch of red-winged blackbirds. Some of those generalist species that just are really good at exploiting a whole bunch of different habitats can sometimes come in and sort of outcompete the highly specialized birds that are the ones that we've been focusing on. So that was one sort of thing that we looked at, was, the characteristics of birds moving into and out of these habitats. Another question was habitat type. Are we seeing more rapid or less rapid changes in terms of the different types of habitats that we were working in? And then the last one was, of course, looking again at climate. Do the changes we see have anything to do with the degree to which the climate is stable in these places? And to do that, we looked at, again, at the temperature and precipitation information during the wintertime and during the breeding season. But in this case, we looked at the degree to which those characteristics varied from long-term sort of climate normal conditions. So does it matter how crazy things are? Does that help us explain some of the patterns with regard to species changes in these habitats? And what we found sort of confirmed some of our thinking. We did find that the persistence of boreal species was higher or highest in sites that had fewer of those sort of more generalist common species in them and increasing in them, and also fewer southern species. And then when I say southern in this instance, I don't mean pelicans from Louisiana. I mean southern birds by way of birds whose geographic center of their distribution is south of the Adirondacks. All of my boreal birds have a range that really is centered to the north of the Adirondacks, but there's a bunch of other birds that use these habitats, like blue jays, that are really sort of broadly distributed in eastern North America, that they're southern in the sense of south of the Adirondacks, but not southern. But sites that had fewer of those birds were more likely to have persistence of the northern species. With regard to the climate question, I didn't see any pattern other than wintertime precipitation. And in this case, it was sites where winter was sort of like the winter that we have always known. The sites that deviated the least from long-term climate normals were the sites that were hanging on to their boreal species the best. And then last, and this was the strongest signal that we saw, the sites that were keeping the highest persistence of boreal species were dominated by that northern peatland category. So the big open bogs were the ones that had the highest degree of sort of persistence of this boreal bird community in comparison to the fen type habitats and the upland forest habitats. So if I had to identify, a perfect site to take information across all of these questions that we've been looking at over the years and sort of identify a site that I think is going to be great for these birds, it might look something like this. This is not a perfect site. This is Bloomingdale Bog for anyone that's been up to the Adirondacks and might have been there. It's got a railroad bed going through it that I'm sure had a huge impact on the hydrology of the site, and it sees a lot of recreation, snowmobiles and all kinds of things. But it's not a perfect site, but it's a darn good site. It's a really nice site, and it's a perfect picture. And so I stole the picture from my colleague Brendan. But I would say that a good site for boreal birds would be something like this. It's got abundant open peatland habitat. It is very large. It is in a region of the park that has other boreal habitat nearby, so it's well connected. Again, within the geography of the Adirondacks, it's at high latitude, it's low elevation. Maybe not this site, but a perfect site would have, a low degree of human footprint, a low proximity of things like roads and development, and therefore it would have fewer sort of potential generalist competitors. It would have a winter that is most like the winter that we have always known. And on average, it would be a site that was potentially more warm and dry over the long term. It would be most likely to hang on to these species. And that's where I want to end and sort of talk through that for a minute, because one of the expected questions, of course, with regard to this research is, well, if warm and dry is good for these birds, then why are we worried about climate change? If it's going to get warmer, but that's okay with them and they favor these warmer sites, what do we have to worry about? And so I have some thoughts about this, and they may or may not be the right kind of thoughts, but this is my interpretation of what we're finding. One is that, these are songbirds and they aren't moose. There's a moose from one of Steve Langdon's camera traps in one of his bogs. But these are tiny little species that weigh as much as, a couple of dimes. They aren't going to have the same sort of physiological threat from warm temperatures as something like a moose that really is going to suffer from high temperature, that's going to need to get in the water to cool down and get away from ticks. At the same time, warm temperature can be associated with other factors that help birds, like higher abundance of insects, which are a really important food source, of course. Warmer temperatures can also be associated with higher survivorship for their nestlings, for example. So I think just the fact that it's warmer is not necessarily going to be a threat to these species. And on any given day, a warmer, dry day might be a better day to raise young than a colder, wetter day. The other thing that I think is happening here is that there's a bit of an overlap in many of these favorable characteristics just within the geography of the Adirondacks. I seem to have lost my little circles that denote these places, but what you see on the map here is the polygon around the sort of northwest quadrant of the park is the area of the park that we often refer to as sort of the boreal core. And it is the place where we have the highest concentration of these large wetland complexes, sort of the best sites in terms of size and connectedness are all in that region of the park. And you may be familiar with some of those names if you come up here to come to birding festivals and things like that. These are the spots that the birders know and they go to because they are kind of the charismatic megabogs of the Adirondacks. So they're all in sort of that northwest quadrant. That part of the park, at the same time as having that geography, it does have lower human footprint. than some other regions of the park. It is at lower elevation and it is at high latitude. And because of the sort of terrain, it's just warmer and drier. The prevailing patterns of precipitation follow the sort of higher elevation habitats and are kind of running sort of northeast to southwest. And so it's a little bit hard, I think, to separate some of these factors and say, you know, it is one thing versus another. I think that just happens to be the part of the park that sort of combines many of these favorable characteristics, whereas some of the smaller, more isolated sites, which are all over the park, probably have to contend with several of the negative factors at the same time. So on the one hand, I think that a warmer temperature is probably conflated with some of the other factors that we're seeing in some of these places. I also think that warming temperatures are not necessarily a physiological threat to these birds. But I do want to make the point that those same combination of factors, warm and dry, are the factors that will eventually take a site that looks like this one and change it to something else over time. These big open peatlands, you can sort of think of them as a constant battle between the sphagnum and the trees. And the sphagnum generally wins the battle because they don't mind the low nutrient conditions, they don't mind the acidity, and they don't mind having their feet wet, and the trees don't like that. But if we get a couple of years in a row where it's warmer and drier, those are the very conditions that will enable the tree seedlings to get a foothold and become established and grow in these habitats. And that sort of encroachment of shrubs and trees is something that we're seeing not just here in the big open peatlands in the Adirondacks, but you know, in other kinds of northern habitats in the northern hemisphere. And for example, in tundra habitat that we think of as treeless, we're starting to see these changes as a result of climate change, whereby we get sort of an encroachment of trees and shrubs into places that, you know, weren't like that previously. So of course, that doesn't mean they will become unusable, but it might make them less favorable to certain species over time. So maybe in the short term, you know, the warm temperature is not necessarily a problem for these birds, but in the long term, I think those warm temperatures, particularly if they're combined with dry spells during certain parts of the year, are going to have profound impacts on the structure of some of these habitats over time. I want to sort of end on a not negative note, though. I have a hard time sometimes giving this talk and spending a lot of time talking about how we're losing all of our boreal birds. It's true that the trajectories that I am seeing for many of the species that we're following are downward. I'm not without hope, though. Some of them are more downward than others, and some are holding their own, and palm warbler, for whatever reason, is doing spectacularly well. So I do have hope that, you know, maybe what we're seeing is an interim pattern, and some of these can be turned around. I'm not sure, but I also want to make the point that they are incredibly important habitats for lots and lots of different species. We have detected many, many different things over the course of the work that we have done in these places. They're also incredibly important habitats for carbon storage. They're going to be valuable to all kinds of wildlife, even if it's not my specific set of 8 birds that I've been tracking for a long time. And if you talk to folks in the conservation organizations, there's a strong focus, I think rightly so, on the notion of resilience, which has many different definitions. But one of them is sort of the idea that, you know, we as conservationists need to really think not so much about the specific species that are on the landscape, but we need to maybe think a bit about protecting the underlying characteristics of a site that enable it to have a lot of species in the first place. It's sort of thinking about, you know, conserving the stage rather than the actual players, you know, making sure that we always have the Yankees, even though the Yankees that are on the team today are not the same Yankees that we had in 1950 or whatever. Sort of that same idea within the biological realm. And so I try to keep that in mind when I think about these places, although I'm terribly sad to think that, you know, someday I will go out there and not be able to find a Lincoln sparrow or a yellow-bellied flycatcher. I still have faith that they are very important habitats, and they're going to be very important habitats for many species over the long term. One example of that is a species that's new to these habitats, but which makes me ecstatically happy And my neighbor who's on this call will laugh at me for doing this, but this is a sandhill crane, which is a species that has been increasing in New York State, probably not because of climate change, probably just a range expansion. I don't know that much about this bird, but it is now breeding in some of these same locations that I've been talking about for an hour. It's breeding in Bloomingdale Bog, it's breeding in Osita Marsh, right next to where Cindy and I live. And that to me is an incredibly positive and interesting development. And so although I will be terribly sad if I lose my rusty blackbird, if in exchange I get this 5 foot tall, incredibly charismatic bird that is a terrific dancer, I'll be okay with that. Thank you. I'm happy to answer your questions if I can.
Well, thank you, Michale. It was a great presentation.
Wonderful.
And
I do
like,
have a couple of questions, though.
Yeah, sure, absolutely.
The first one is, I do have from my limited understanding of why birds migrate, and it has to do with food and shelter and water and breeding. In these areas where you are losing species and numbers, is it any possibility to, I know in some areas they put up bluebird houses for them, so they have something to nest in to increase the bluebird population. Is something like this possible? I don't know if you can do food, but if you could do something like housing, is that a realistic possibility of something to allow the birds to stay in an area?
I do think that there are possibilities. I think that nesting is probably not limiting them a tremendous amount. I think with regard to food, probably my hunch, and that's where I feel like the research needs to go. My hunch is that what we are seeing potentially in the mechanism of climate change in some of these places is this sort of mismatch that's created between when the birds get here and the fact that in some years the insects are emerging earlier than they used to because of all kinds, they're just more closely tracking environmental conditions, whereas the migrants are coming when they're coming, and we get this sort of phenological mismatch of, bud burst happening at the wrong time, or insect, sort of peaks happening at times that birds aren't accustomed to. That is a little bit hard to address, but I have had people ask, is it beneficial to have bird feeders for things like gray jays and birds that are around here in the wintertime? And there are some folks that, if they live in appropriate habitat, will do that. And we know that feeding birds can definitely increase their survivorship. I think what you said right at the end there with regard to housing and development and things like that, I think that there is a role to play, especially with regard to the smaller, more isolated habitats. And one of the ways in which I often am using the results of this research is to write public comment letters to DEC or to APA whenever they're making a decision that has close proximity to some of these habitats. And that's often for us things like recreation management plans for conservation easements, or new developments that happen to be nearby to some of these places. The reason I think that's important is because, we do fortunately have a lot of the big wetland complexes protected. And so other than sort of the impacts of climate change in those places, there's not, I feel pretty good about those places in the future. But most wetlands are not big. Most wetlands are small. And therefore, most of the population, the bulk of it, is not going to be in the big wetlands. As much as we'd like to put all of the birds just in Spring Pond Bog because it's such a great place, we know that we can't. Most of them are going to be, distributed throughout the landscape in the smaller places. And so if there's a way to encourage, buffering of any development that occurs near those places, trying to route things like snowmobile trails or whatever, away from them, I think all of those little actions can probably add up in those more isolated locations. Of course, we want to protect the big ones also, but most of them have a pretty good degree of protection. But I think there's a role to play for the state and for individual landowners, especially in the more isolated spots.
You mentioned before about the clear cutting of or the logging areas, that kind of thing. I don't know. I know from being a resident up in Maine, there was tremendous clear cutting for the paper mills.
Mhm.
And as far as I know, we don't have paper mills in the Adirondacks or nearby, but are the clear cutting areas only for the milling of wood for building, or is it for also paper and other things?
We don't have a tremendous amount of clear cutting, and there is a cap on how big the clear cuts can be.
Okay.
What specifically the products are used for, I couldn't say. I think that in general, I think of clear cutting as kind of a temporary impact to these birds. It might, it would impact the habitat for sure, but it's eventually gonna come back. I think I worry more about large scale sort of industrial logging in the Canadian boreal, and especially places where that's been converted to things like tar sands development. I think here there's certainly an impact, but I think of it as a more temporary one.
Do they have to reinstall the area with the tree or a seed or a seedling after they've removed the tree? Do you know? Or
I
is that-
don't know. I think that they mostly are relying on natural regeneration, but how easy or difficult that is to do in different kinds of habitats, I'm not sure. I know that a good bit of logging is happening in the Adirondacks during the wintertime, which is going to be, fewer of these birds are going to be around.
Right, right.
So especially if you're logging in a place like this, that's really, soft and spongy, they almost have to do it in the wintertime. So that also makes me worry less about the logging factor. But
Michale, this
No.
was a fabulous presentation. I want to thank you very much. Are there any other questions?
Yeah, Jill, there's a number in the chat, so
Good. Okay.
somebody is asking, is anyone doing studies on insects that you know of?
I don't know. I want to say that Angie Ross, who I mentioned as the woman that's been doing the spruce grouse project for years with DEC, she was trying to look into some food resources, but I don't know what the result of any of that work has been. Unfortunately, the folks that are really good at taxonomy of insects there's not that many of them. So even if I was to go out and collect information on insects or do sort of bug surveys in these habitats, I would still need help from someone who could identify all those things. But I think my hunch is that notion of phenological mismatch, as they say, is one of the potential impacts of climate change on these birds.
A question whether you've utilized any of the other sources of data like the New York State Breeding Bird Atlas.
I do look at the breeding bird atlas in terms of sort of comparing what I'm finding. It's a little bit, the point of the atlas is more of a snapshot of the landscape in a very, very, very broad scale, whereas this is a much smaller scale and looking at long-term changes. The other difference is that the atlas is going out and specifically trying to document evidence of breeding, which we are not doing. We're just generally listening and documenting whether or not the birds are present. So it's somewhat of a different comparison. One is more about identifying distributions of birds and evidence of breeding, and this one is more about long-term changes. But I am working with DEC, they have supported the monitoring in the past several years, and they're very interested in taking all of our information and incorporating it into the atlas and trying to do that, which is great. I'm thrilled if the information gets into the atlas, but we don't spend as much time in any individual habitat trying to figure out all of those sort of breeding codes. We're sort of saying like, okay, I hear the bird, that's check, we've got it here. Which in the realm of the atlas only tells you, I think, probable breeding. So,
right. Question: how do you define a low density residential area? because we don't
So-
have those here.
Yeah. So the sort of definition of ex-urban development, the kind of development that my colleague Heidi and I have studied for a long time, is not development in town. It really is sort of backcountry, and it's characterized by two things. One is generally large lot sizes, and the other one is, you know, the matrix in which you place these houses is, you're not changing that. It's sort of like you still have interior forest, but you've distributed houses and roads in a really sort of spread out way within it, and that ends up creating sort of, you know, perforation rather than, you know, it's not pavement, it's not becoming farmed, it's not being clear cut, it's just, it's perforated by roads and houses. And although it's hard to even see those things, they do have impacts. We can definitely detect those impacts. And we've studied this in the Adirondacks. We've also studied this a bunch in the West, where the lot sizes are much bigger, and sort of seen similar kinds of patterns in both places. But that's kind of what we mean by ex-urban development, or rural sprawl, if you want to give it a different name.
Yeah, and I've noticed a sort of bizarre, I don't know why. It's like, oh, I've got 3 acres of woods. Let's cut it all down and put a house in the middle.
Yeah. that I don't know, it's interesting. The Adirondacks has always, I think, had this this kind of romance with you know, the great camps, and like the modern day, we don't so much have great camps anymore, but you know, the modern day desire to still have those really back in the woods places.
Yeah.
And I, you know, I understand that. Of course, we all want to have a home in the woods, but it just, we have tried to find ways to suggest, you know, how you would go about developing that still is a, you know, still a home in the woods, but maybe not one where every single house is spaced out as far as possible, in the interest of minimizing, you know, roads and fragmentation. And of course, we have looked at this from the perspective of wildlife and impacts to wildlife, which is not always everyone's top concern, unfortunately. But all the things that I would recommend with regard to sort of thinking about maintaining, you know, connectivity on the landscape and maintaining habitats, it's all the same sort of recommendations that you would also make to fight climate change and to protect water quality. And, you know, so sometimes I like to talk about it in terms of like, if you want to keep good water quality, then don't have everything sprawling everywhere. You know, if you want to not contribute toward increased carbon going into the atmosphere, then don't build these enormously long driveways. You know, just the basic idea is sort of try to, you don't want to say clustering because it's a bad word, but try to put the development near other development to the degree that you can, and sort of overlap the human habitat and then enable the other undeveloped habitat to similarly be clumped together.
Yeah, okay, let's see. Have you correlated your studies with those of insect population, native plants, etc.?
I haven't. As I said, I don't really know anyone that has good information on insects from the habitats that we are working in. I do know some folks at Paul Smith's and elsewhere who have looked at long-term phenological changes, and that's been sort of on my list to look at what they are seeing in terms of, they've been tracking stuff like bud burst and certain kinds of insects, and just to look and see what patterns they're seeing and how that maybe helps me understand what we might be seeing in the birds. But I haven't formally done any kind of comparison.
Okay, and what can an average citizen do to address this?
I always want to say that, you know, again, the kinds of recommendations I would say to protect these habitats are many of the same kind of recommendations I would say to protect any habitat. It's sort of, you know, try to keep big chunks of it, try to keep it intact, try to not fragment it. buffering these habitats, I think, can be really important. I think, as I mentioned previously, worrying about the smaller wetlands is probably more relevant to most of us than the big ones, just in the sort of geography of the Adirondacks, because most of us probably live with little wetlands nearby, and most of us probably don't live near the really, really big ones. But those little ones, you know, if there are potential threats to them that you notice and could potentially do anything about, then I think all of those actions can add up. I always tell this story that I was once at a meeting on road ecology. I was at the the regional conference on roads and transportation and ecology, and there was a woman there giving a talk, and she was not a scientist, she was like a nurse or something, I don't know, but her whole talk was about showing photos from an underground passage that had been put in under a section of roadway somewhere outside of Boston. And it was just picture after picture of critters running through this, you know, connectivity, you know, underpass that they had built in this particular part of Boston. Her whole point was, this was not a place anywhere on the landscape that anyone would have identified and said, like, yes, that's an absolutely critical place where you have to put in this underpass for wildlife. Her point was, we did this because Richard Foreman, who's the father of landscape ecology, lived in our neighborhood and he helped us do it. And nobody would have said that this is a critical place, but look at the enormous difference it made to all of these species who otherwise would have been smushed on the road. And that has stuck in my head forever, because I really truly believe that although we always want to focus on, you know, the best and the biggest habitats and worrying about them and prioritizing which one's the right one and all of that, I really honestly believe that even little bits of conservation action that you do in your own backyard, all of it adds up. You know, if you do something that is beneficial, you're going to benefit species right in your own yard that, you know, might not have otherwise benefited. And similarly, if other people learn from what you're doing, that's all valuable. So I would always say, you know, anything that you can do to help birds, all of those wonderful like graphics that Cornell puts out about, you know, what we can do to protect birds are all relevant to these and to other species as well. For the boreal birds in particular, you know, speaking out about climate change, caring about climate change, and, you know, little actions that we can do. Of course, it's a huge global problem, but I think other actions to protect their habitats can certainly help them.
Another question. Do you know the birds that are declining, do you think they have gone elsewhere, or are they gone like failed breeding, migratory disasters, and you had two that are resident, so.
Yeah, I think that some of what I'm seeing, I think, might just be retreating, sort of range retraction, and they're maybe spending more time and more likely to be breeding up north. And I think it's probably part of a bigger process of, as these birds, you know, as they sort of move to the north, as we have seen with lots of populations of different taxa all around the planet, you know, it's maybe not that our habitat has instantly become unfavorable to them, but there is some importance of where your buddies are, you know, like if they can't find other birds and the populations spread more and more thin, they're going to gravitate to places where, you know, there's just more of them. That notion of sort of having your fellow species around is important. So I think part of it is that process of range retraction going on. I do, however, think that it's possible that boreal chickadee, for example, that it's getting harder and harder for me to find. We used to find it more often in the sites that we're working in. It could be just choosing to use high elevation habitat. And I don't know, because we're not, you know, I can't make a direct comparison of my work to the mountain birdwatch folks. I think that the mountain birdwatch folks have not seen a decline in boreal chickadee. So I'm hoping that even though I'm not seeing it as much in the low boreal where I used to see it, that it's doing just fine in the high. That's not an option for palm warbler and linked sparrow and some of the other birds, but it is an option for boreal chickadee. It is, yellow-bellied could be up high, the blackback could be up high, the gray jay could be up high. So I have some hope that they may be finding other resources that they want in those higher places. And there's just no way for me to be able to know that they might have left my wetland and gone up high. The blackback woodpecker is another example of a resident bird that we are seeing declines in, but it's an interesting one because it is a species that, they are sort of responsive. They're kind of nomadic, and they are responsive to any situation on the ground. They really like recently dead trees. So a situation on the ground that creates a whole bunch of recently dead trees is something that they will absolutely key into. And so a fire, for example, they can detect from a long ways away and travel to that place because those recently dead killed trees are going to have the critters that they want in the, in the bark beetles that they're looking for. An insect infestation, similarly, that creates something like that. So it is also possible with that particular species that although I'm in, very, very appropriate habitat for them, if there was a fire that I didn't know about that just created a bunch of temporary great woodpecker habitat, that's where they might have gone. and again, we might be just missing them, so there are some background factors to some of these patterns that make me, not quite as worried, because it is possible that they have found resources in other places and they're just not in the places where we are.
Michale, someone wrote too a little bit earlier. Have you compared your data to other sources like the NYSBBA? I don't
Yeah,
know what it is.
Jean, we asked that question.
Oh, you did? I'm sorry. I thought you didn't. I'm sorry.
Yep, the data now are going into the atlas, which is great.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Are there any additional questions? Anybody? If you have one, just unmute and ask.
I think we're all.
Okay, thank you so very much.
Thank you very much. That was excellent. Thank you.
Absolutely
Thank you.
fabulous.
Thank you.
It's great.
And
Thank you
let
for
us know
having me.
how you make out with your further data. And
Okay.
hopefully you'll find the birds higher up and not disappearing. And-
Now that my husband has retired as a forest ranger, he's no longer watching the mountaintops for me, so I don't know what I'm gonna do.
It's been wonderful. From where are you zooming from?
I am zooming from Saranac Lake. I'm in the office of my colleague's husband's boat shop because my Raybrook internet is terrible, but I'm in Saranac Lake.
Well, thank you so very much. It's wonderful to be able to do this from further distance.
Right.
And
Yes.
It is wonderful.
It's
Thank
just
you.
been great and perfect presentation. Thank you so very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good night.
All right, good night, all.
All right,
Jennifer,
good night.
thank you again for the administration of the Zoom, and everybody else have
Good
a
night,
good.
everybody.
Thank you for joining us.
Good night.
Have a good
Good
night.
night.